Hi everyone. Today's guest is the brilliant actor Harry Lloyd, whose first professional role was playing James Steerforth in the BBC adaptation of David Copperfield. He then went on to play characters such as Jeremy Baines in Doctor Who, Viserys in Game of Thrones, Harry Percy in Wolf Hall, and Charles Xavier in Legion, as well as Herbert Pocket in the 2011 BBC adaptation of Great Expectations. Harry's theatre credits range from The Duchess of Malfi to A View from the Bridge in London's West End, and his films include The Iron Lady and The Theory of Everything. Harry is also Charles Dickens's great-great-great-grandson, and in this special episode, he and I have both been granted an exclusive preview of the first 2 episodes of FX's upcoming Great Expectations, adapted by Stephen Knight and starring Olivia Colman. We are, of course, very careful to avoid spoilers, but since many of you listening will be itching to know more about the series, I hope you enjoy the various clues we put out there for you. Harry, welcome to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire. It's lovely to have you here.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It's exciting on many levels. One, you're obviously a very, very well-established actor, and you've acted in various Dickens adaptations that we're going to talk about, but you're also a descendant of the great man himself. So my first question for you then is, what are your early memories of Dickens?
Interesting. Well, I remember one of my earliest memories when I think I found it when I must have been told, and bearing in mind where I can picture this conversation happening, I must have been about 6 or 7, being in the back of a friend's car. And something about Dickens or something came up, and the mother mentioned it. And I said, "Oh, I'm related to him." And she said, "No, you're not." And I was disbelieved, because something that some silly 6-year-old will say when Dickens is in the conversation. I remember looking out the window, being a bit confused, and being like, "No, but I literally, my mum just told me quite recently this is this new name that I'm aware of." So my first memory was the fact that I was this Dickensian imposter right from the start. I had to get it corroborated. I had to. When I was dropped off, I got my mum to, no, he really is, and it was. I think there was some kind of, with my uncle especially, was some kind of reading or some kind of after dinner written down, not performance, but something slightly Dickensian. And I think as a kid, I had one line, which was "God bless us, everyone," or something quite wholesome and hearty. So it was around, but it wasn't until I discovered him for myself, I would say, I think I read Tale of Two Cities when I was about 12, which put me off because I was too young, and I read the whole book and I didn't understand it, and I was too proud to admit it. And I kind of retreated. And then at 16, I saw Simon Callow's one-man show, The Mystery of Charles Dickens. And I was like, "Oh, he's funny." I had no idea. And so I went right back to the start. And the funniest bits were from this thing called Pickwick Papers. So I picked up Pickwick Papers. I was like, "Oh, all right, this is the beginning." And I kind of worked my way through from there. And from then on, I had a personal relationship and didn't really have to worry about what to do with the lineage aspect of it. I just kind of became a fan like anyone else.
That's amazing. That's an amazing first contact with your ancestor there. I'm worrying about whether your mother had lied to you then early on.
Yeah, no, I thought maybe there was some big hoax that clearly that I'd been stitched up.
You don't feel any psychological damage from having been gaslit immediately at that young age?
No, my psychological damage comes from many other places.
Sure.
But no, Dickens is not responsible for any of that.
So, but it's interesting you mentioned Simon Callow a moment ago, because I saw The Mystery of Charles Dickens as well, that solo show he did with Peter Ackroyd. That was astonishingly good, wasn't it?
It was.
I think that got me into Dickens as well. I think a lot of people, probably from our generation, that saw that were inspired by him.
It was the excerpts, and it was the conversation, but also the reading. And it was the fact that this was a writer, but he was an actor. He was a performer. He was an entertainer in his own right. And he had all these different kind of tools. So just with a stand, a chair, and a glass of water, and 2 hours, worlds could be woven in front of you. And I think that was, especially as a teenager, made him more accessible and more relevant, I suppose.
Yeah. And I suppose, knowing yourself to be a descendant, Throughout your life, how has that felt? Has there been times when you felt very, obviously very proud and excited by it, but have there been times when you've kind of wanted to run away from that as well?
Absolutely, yes. I especially when because I discovered, I suppose, acting my first term at boarding school when I was about 8. So it wasn't because of my love of Dickens, and I didn't feel the acting was always my, in a way, that was my cloak, that was my way of getting through the strangeness of life on my own. I was good at reading. My parents both work in publishing, and so I thought that's my passport. And it was always something that more I got into it and realized that, oh gosh, then people will ask me about the Dickens thing. I very much wanted to be my own actor, and this was my thing. I didn't want to be I was scared of nepotism, I suppose, the idea that I was granted this. But then, of course, my first professional job, I played Steerforth in David Copperfield when I was 15. So much for that. But yes, there are definitely times when as an actor, you have the opportunity to run away from all sorts of parts of your life. That I was this middle class, white, public school educated kid who wanted to be anything but that, frankly, as well as all of the Dickens stuff. I just wanted to have access at least to the rest of the world, and was, I think, quite embarrassed growing up sometimes of where I came from. And acting always allowed me to go, and if I was good enough, I could be anyone. I was more excited by the fact that my first job out of university was playing like a shoplifter on the bill. So I thought, that is, Steerforth. I'm surrounded by Steerforths. This guy, I don't really know these people, and it's quite exciting for me, a little Exetonian, being on the bill. So I definitely ran away from both Dickens and the whole kind of Steerforthian world that I was from, and wanted to get established, I suppose, in my own right. And then secretly in my head thought, yeah, but when I retire, I'll do reading tours, and it'll be my retirement. I'll sit back and do Dickens later. But actually, quietly, I've been actually getting back into him now, to be honest. I read voraciously about 12 of his 16 novels by my mid-20s, and I stopped for about 10 years. And I did run away from it. And I feel myself actually now coming back to it and seeing him also just as an author and as a man, and not just as a relative.
So was this in 1998, 1999 that this BBC adaptation of David Copperfield came up?
Yes.
What were the steps then that got you in that?
So a lovely, now sadly departed casting director called Carrie Hilton was going around lots of different schools looking for young kids to be in this new Andrew Davies BBC adaptation. And they came to Eton, where I was rehearsing a play, of course, and she sat in on a play rehearsal. And me and two of the other kids in this play rehearsal were asked to come down to BBC, and a teacher drove us down in his car the next week. And we had a meeting. I remember the producer, Kate Harwood, who's now a very esteemed TV producer. I can't remember if there was something to read or if we just had a chat, but I remember precociously slipping it into the conversation 100% that, oh, I do happen to be. And then when I got the part, they said, it's not because of that, it's because you were so interested in the thing, whatever. But I always knew secretly, yeah, I did absolutely cash in on it, and I did really want it to use it as a ticket. I remember there was actually, my dad showed it to me at the time. There was a tiny little, they used to have a thing in Private Eye, this little column called Yeah, Right, or something. And they would take headlines that they didn't believe from that week's news. And one of them was, the BBC have just cast Dickens' descendant Harry Lloyd in David Copperfield, not knowing his illustrious ancestry. Yeah, right. And I remember thinking, as this kind of young child, I'm busted. I've been caught. This is terrible. I'm not an actor. And I did what I always didn't want to do, which is just to kind of cash in on my lineage passport. But the fact is, I loved it. And more than being involved in his world, being on a film set was a magical experience. And I remember being on this set in Liverpool where we filmed my bits, thinking, is this how they do it? Is this how they film it? It's just so slow. But there's just so many people for this tiny little detail. I was fascinated by it. They said action, and I forgot to go because I was so distracted by all the extras and horses and sound people. And
how nerve-wracking was it for you to play that part and go in? Because was that your first big professional?
It was my first professional anything. Yeah, I was 15. It was me and the young 11-year-old Daniel Radcliffe.
With Ian McKellen as your school teacher.
And I didn't know who he was, really. I remember having on a break between kind of setups, it's some kind of National Trust house where we were filming, finding myself on some veranda eating cucumber sandwiches with Ian McKellen, and me thinking, God, what do you say to actors? So you say, so what are you doing next? He was like, oh, well, I'm going off to New Zealand soon to play Gandalf in Lord of the Rings, and then I'm going to play Magneto in the X-Men. And actually, those are two things I've heard of. And I'm 15. I think, oh my, those are the two coolest parts ever. And he said, what are you doing? And I went, GCSEs. That's it. But he was lovely.
But of course, fans of X-Men will trace a line here with you having cucumber sandwiches with Magneto being a young Charles Xavier.
It all comes
which
full
is
circle.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? There's some sort of parallel universe here where
Yeah.
But it's extraordinary because at the age of 15 I can imagine it being quite daunting, but at the same time you're not old enough to know all the so-called rules that would make you even more nervous, possibly. Did you find that you were comfortable in your own skin? You as Steerforth, you're in Etonian garb essentially in lots of ways, aren't you? So that you've lived an aspect of that character every single day for quite a few years.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, Steerforth is the guys at school that you don't like. And, and I guess it's easy if you are nervous playing someone with extreme confidence. You just, in a way, you have to go along with it. And having someone younger than me, and Daniel was his first time doing anything. We kind of could be new together, but when the camera rolls, I had to look after him and actually make it look like I knew what I was doing, which I think gave me confidence. I know what I'm doing. This is a film set. And it's funny, yeah. I don't remember a huge amount about it. I remember watching it and being horrified just by my bits, which I never kind of got over. And the fact they had to curl my hair with these tongs, I just thought I looked silly. But they had to also give me contact lenses because the guy who played me as an older man had blue eyes, so I got contact lenses fitted. And it was the stuff like that that made me think, my gosh, is that what the detail? I mean, we've thought of stuff like this. It was the practical stuff that really blew my mind.
So Harry, having read, did you say 12? At least 12 of Dickens?
I think technically I've probably read 12 of the 16, but yeah, I haven't. I mean, I've reread Great Expectations because I did the audiobook during lockdown. But apart from that, yeah, the last book I read, I think, was in about 2006. I read Dombey and Son. I don't think I've read a new book of his since then. And I studied him at university, which was really good because the first essay I wrote for my very scary English tutor at Oxford, I was trying to show off, in a way, my kind of broad range of knowledge about him and his life. And I read the big Peter Ackroyd biography. And he basically trashed it, my tutor, and he said, you're writing like a fan. Let's put him to the sword. What's Dickens not good at? Let's treat him like another author. And I'd always put him in his own little canon. And of course, with the Oxford degree, you do study English literature from kind of Beowulf through. You see the relationship from everything to everything else, that no one lives in isolation. And actually comparing him to Hardy or comparing him to Eliot or comparing him to Austen, even actually put him in the literary canon was really good. And to talk about why are his women like that. And because I loved literature, I didn't want him to exist in this separate place just because he was my great-great-great-grandfather. And I actually began to appreciate him much more when I treated him like another author.
That's probably quite helpful when you come to perform Dickens, that you don't...
Yeah. I never feel like confidence in the blood, as it were.
Yeah.
But I guess any confidence comes from the fact that I've been aware of him. And even if I've not read as much as other people, I've had him in my thoughts or adjacent to my thoughts for most of my life. So I have a comfort with him. I'm not intimidated by him in the way that I would be if I suddenly had to, when I'm doing John Webster or something, crikey, this is dense and tricky and I don't really know enough about it. I'm by no means an expert on Dickens, but I'm, I guess, comfortable with him.
Do you have any mementos or family heirlooms that have been passed down from Dickens to you personally?
Me personally? No,
Yeah.
I wish. No. I mean, there are some in the family. There are some lovely ones. My Uncle Mark, he has a desk in his house. I believe his wife, my Auntie Debbie, has the ring that Mary Hogarth, Dickens' sister-in-law, who died in his arms when she was 16, the ring she was wearing that I believe he wore for the rest of his life, supposedly. I've seen that ring. That's in the family's possession, stuff like that. That's pretty special. But I don't myself have anything apart from some early editions that I've collected, but nothing original, no first edition, nothing that's been. I think my mum has a first edition of Oliver Twist on her shelf, which I've seen. But I am no, I'm going to have to wait a while. I'll buy some later.
The ring that Mary Hogarth wore, that's quite special. What does it look like?
It's a ruby. I haven't seen it for years, but I think she showed it to me a long time ago, and I think it's quite gaudy. I think it's got this red, quite big ruby on it, and some kind of engraving, perhaps on the inside. It's almost like an engagement ring. I can't remember it honestly, and some Dickens buffs will be screaming. They'll know, no, it's in the Philadelphia Museum. But it's no, I'm pretty sure Auntie Debbie showed that to me, and I remember that when I was at university at a similar time, learning about the two types of women always seemed to be these little Nell virgins like Mary who were frozen at age of 16 and never grew up because this girl died in his arms, and the crazy batty old chatty women like his mother. And I always thought, okay, that makes sense, and began to kind of weaving things from his life into his characters until you meet Estella and suddenly thinking, okay, who are you? And understanding that with him as someone who drew from his walks and drew from his life and was this just extraordinary filter for the madness of the Victorian society.
It's interesting because obviously, your main focus has been the acting, and it was something that obviously Dickens really wanted to do himself. And
he missed that early audition. I always think
yeah,
that's a great story. That if it could have gone a different way at 16, he had the audition for the Covent Garden Theatre, and it was some kind of illness that stopped him going that day. And obviously, if he'd gone in that day, he might have entered into this company and wouldn't have been a parliamentary reporter, therefore wouldn't have written sketches by Boz, etc., etc., etc. But he was very much an actor, and I recognise that, and I can absolutely reading just the energy of his words. You can tell some of it is written very quickly. It's still very conversational. You can imagine him standing up and talking in the mirror and shouting and trying to, that woman who he saw in the market yesterday, trying to work out how to describe the sneer on her face. And there's something very muscular about it, but it's lived in. You're aware of this entertainer. He puts himself into the narrative, which is why they work so well when they're read out loud, I have to say. Yeah. So no, I think him, whether he started as an actor and would end up writing, or he ended up being a writer and always found time to do plays and putting on plays at Christmas and being in plays with Wilkie, etc. I do think he was absolutely both, and which is why the reading tours, and he did them to such success, and they almost killed him. It seemed like it. There's not many authors who are the best people at reading their own work aloud, no. And he 100% was.
Yeah. No, he absolutely was. Yes. And that conversational element's fantastic, isn't it? All that quirkiness and the workings out that he leaves on the page where he's trying, like you said, trying to describe something.
And the fact that he is so accessible and deliberately.
So coming back to your acting again, Harry, having played Steerforth and many other roles by this point, how did you then approach Herbert Pocket for the BBC adaptation? When was that one? Was that
2011?
Yeah.
We filmed it that summer. I mean, Herbert, frankly, is just the most delightful man I've ever played. I adore him.
That was when I first was aware of you, actually, was playing Herbert in that. I thought you really got him.
I loved him. I mean, like a lot of, especially when I'm playing someone based on a book who's not the main character, a bit like Viserys even in Game of Thrones, I can, read the book and digest it, and then I kind of throw it away, and I quite often rewrite it, actually. And I remember writing, I was in America that before we started filming, I remember writing Herbert's kind of diary a lot and writing about his relationship with Clara and all the stuff I'd pieced together from the novel that Pip doesn't know about, but actually what he must have done and how he must have got himself cut off from his family and what his relationship would have been with the pockets of Hammersmith. And just creating a plot out of a subplot ultimately and enjoying the writing of it. Not that anyone else needed to see it, but still writing in a way that Herbert would have done. And that then gave me confidence to go and be in this wider story, but also have my own little story.
That's really something. Do you still have the diaries kicking around somewhere, Herbert's diaries?
You know what, I do, yeah. I have a rucksack of notebooks upstairs, and I think I know which one it is. I spilt water over one of the books. A lot of it is been diluted, and you can't read half of it. But no, it was mainly about him and his love for Clara, and also how he what he recognized in Pip. But once I understood his relationship with his family and his relationship with money, which is the opposite relationship that Pip has with money, that he came from it and he eschewed it, whereas Pip never had it and always needed it. And them coming from the other ends of the spectrum, but meeting in the middle. And he never judges Pip for it. And he's always got this respect and love for him, despite their, ridiculous first encounter. Yeah, I haven't thought about him for a while. I love Herbert.
Well, all of that background that you did, I mean, it really came off on the screen. It's so interesting to hear you talk about that, because I remember an exchange. I think you're in one of the London clubs with Pip, and I don't know whether Pip does something. He orders champagne for everybody, or he places a bet, or he does something. And Herbert, you very gently suggest that might not be a good idea. His loyalty to Pip comes ahead of everything.
It is about the way about being a gentleman. Which there's something about Herbert that it's ingrained in him now. He never had to learn it. He was raised one. But there is, in a way, the trappings of being a gentleman, which is what gives it a bad rap, which is kind of the lessons that Miss Havisham perhaps teaches Pip. But there is a way of being a good gentleman, which is actually, it is about respect and deference, and it isn't about just forwarding the empire and treading on the poor. And I think that's what Herbert embodies, and it's important to remember that. And I like to think that Pip learns his real lessons of how to be a gentleman and to learn humility, which I think is something that he never understood was part of being a gentleman. And Herbert is someone who I think is, despite where he's from, is someone incredibly humble, because I think he's realized that love is far more important than money. And he has this incredible kind of old wisdom about him, despite being a young guy in his 20s.
So, Harry, we're talking about something quite special today because we've been granted early access to the first 2 episodes of the upcoming FX adaptation of Great Expectations.
What is your intention?
My intention is to make my fortune so that love is not so hard to find.
And so it begins.
So there are many things that we want to say and can't say because of spoilers. Mm-hmm. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how this part of the chat, how this turns out. But I'd love to know your first thoughts on having seen it.
I thought it was excellent. I watched the first episode last night and the second episode this morning. Great Expectations is my favorite book. I know it very well. I was in the 2011 adaptation. I read it twice when I was studying it at university. I've written theses on it. I did the audiobook for Penguin a couple of years ago. And this is like no other adaptation I've seen. There are plot details and there are incidents that don't occur in the text. But the scaffolding of the story is absolutely there. And it's not a revolution. It's just shone a light in some corners that Dickens didn't look at. And I have to say, none of it jarred for me at all. It actually heightened and made me reassess how murky and psychologically confused this strange journey of this blacksmith's boy who is almost kind of tempted by these different kind of serpentine forces into becoming a gentleman, and only learns how to become a man really by the end. I found it really impressive. Overall, I thought it was cast exceptionally. In that first episode, the boy who plays the young Pip, I thought was a fascinating
Tom Sweet.
Fascinating character.
Yeah, he's very, very good, isn't he?
And I think there was, again, I hope I'm allowed to say this, but one kind of small difference that I noticed that I thought actually worked really well was the fact that in this version, Pip was, even before he meets Magwitch or Miss Havisham, he was the smartest boy in town. He could remember facts and dates. And he was already talking to Joe about how he doesn't want to work in the blacksmith store anymore when he's older. I thought it worked really well that he was already slightly precociously talented, didn't know where to put that from just naturally.
Yeah.
And that actually suddenly, it gave him more ownership of his own twisted dream of becoming a gentleman and what he wanted to do. He just knew that there was one line he talks about, I see the ships going out every night down the Thames. And you realize that you live at the doorstep of the empire. And they talk about the empire, and I don't remember the empire and the concept of it being in the book so much. And I thought that was something that was a really great introduction. And the idea that, of course, in the Medway, you see all of the ships going out to the empire and coming back with tusks and opium and tea. And therefore thinking, I want to be at the heart of that. I want to go to London and I want to go out on one of those ships and And our relationship with knowing that even though I live on the marshes, I'm part of an empire, and what that would have done to your aspirations and your expectations. I thought that details like that, I thought that was a really smart and interesting and pertinently modern addition.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what Stephen Knight does so well is he takes a lot of these character aspirations and he turns the dial up on a lot of them, doesn't he? So yes, so Pip, from the outset, we see him in the forge. He's already, quoting Shakespeare, and he's really ready to strike out.
Be not afraid of greatness. Some are born great, and some of greatness thrust upon them.
Other things that are implied in the book, you get to see a bit more. And I think because obviously it's not shot as a first-person narrative for Pip, you see so much through the eyes of the other characters. I think it's very interesting, things like Owen MacDonald's portrayal of Joe. Joe isn't a simpleton. Sometimes you can read him as a bit, naive, obviously, in the book, but Joe is sort of a bit more present and a bit more aware and a bit more, a bit wiser, really, I think, which is interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that goes for a lot of characters. I think that they're slightly more, it doesn't tend to the cartoony aspect of it. It doesn't allow even Pumblechook to be someone frivolous who's there for the scenery and, the funny Dickensian pantomime aspect of it. That even with Pumblechook, we will glimpse the darkness and someone who is aware of his own contradictions and duplicity. Same with Mrs. Joe, same with, I think, all of them. Even Miss Havisham, even Miss Stella, they're all, I think, slightly more self-aware, I would say, would be the general note, and how all of these characters have both been heightened but also naturalized. And like you say, we will see things that perhaps were hinted at. And also their introduction of certain things to allow us to be shocked again, without going into any details. There are some things that you see that, for me, I thought, actually, yes, of course, maybe that did happen. Dickens never mentioned it, but it doesn't contradict anything that he says, but it just filled in a slightly dark corner and allowed us to see it and just reminded us of quite how messed up this story is. And I think the way that it introduces Miss Havisham's, I mean, it's not explicit in any way, but there is this strange sense of this fetish. It's not simply this old lady who wants to have her revenge on men. There's something dark and twisted, and she knows it, and she loves it, but she hates it.
When I was young, I was blinded by love. Look on what remains of me. You can break his heart, and I can watch the breakage.
And there's that complexity from all of them. Pip wants to be a gentleman, but he feels guilty. Estella wants to be part of this plan to please her adopted mother, but also at the same time has her own issues with the life she's leading and she's resented. Everyone seems conflicted, and I also think that's a very good starting point for any, not just adaptation, but story.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I thought, I was very impressed by Laurie Ogden playing young Biddy. We see so much more of Biddy. We can say that, can't we? And she's, again, you know what she can see straight away. What takes probably pages in the novel for it to be revealed to us because it's being told through Pip's memories.
There's a great sequence, especially when, after Biddy's grown up a bit in episode 2, Pip had to learn French. And it becomes this nice little 6 or 7 minute sequence, and seeing Biddy teach him and seeing how quickly Pip gets to grips with it, and seeing something that, to begin with, when Estella says bonjour and he doesn't even know what she's saying. I think Steve found some really good ways of condensing certain aspects of the novel whilst staying true to it, I would say.
Yeah, and what I like from Stephen Knight, though, is also, and I think it's following on from what you're saying, is that you'll read something in the book and it will leave some sort of impression in your mind, a little wash of an idea, and then Stephen puts it out there fully formed. And I was watching it, and many times it happened, I thought, oh yes, there is something in the relationship between these two characters. There is a flirtation that happens that I remember sort of taking up, but then dismissing very quickly.
Yeah.
And he puts it right in there. That's really fun. So people that love Dickens and know the story backwards can really, really enjoy that. But of course, that wonderful thing of being able to see things with fresh eyes, which he does, because that feeling, and I felt it the same with Stephen Knight's A Christmas Carol that he did as well for FX. We know this story better than any other story ever told. But you genuinely didn't know what was coming. You genuinely didn't know how this was going to appear, this next ghost.
But I also think it's sort of very clearly told. And if you've never seen Great Expectations before, if this is your first experience of it, you would then go and read the book and you'd be amazed at how much of it actually is in the book and how much he has just expanded on themes that are suggested in the novel, despite it feeling very, not modern. It feels very much of its, time set in the early 19th century, but it's the psychology of it and the way that he found different visual and other ways of tying these strange characters together whilst keeping the tone very realistic and very dark. But also there is this strange kind of mystery around the whole thing. There's always been something about the marshes, especially in the first episodes of any Great Expectations adaptation, the smoke and the distant ships. There's something very contained about this small little magical world, which we're then going to burst open when we come to London. The world, I thought, was created excellently.
I wonder, Harry, when you sat down, you pressed play on episode 1, were you thinking, I was definitely thinking this, I was thinking, oh, right, here we go then, Great Expectations, how are they going to present the marshes then? What's the first thing we're going to see?
Yeah.
Smoke, and of course it doesn't. That's not what you see. I'm going to go as far as I can here. What you see is a bright blue sky on a bridge, and it's a flash forward, and you see Finn Whitehead, who's the older Pip, walking on the bridge and looking down into the water. And then something happens, and we then go back.
And we'll go back 7 years earlier.
Yeah.
You're expecting it to fade up from black. It'll be smoky. There'll be a kid in the graveyard. Oh, give me your, and then we'll go straight into the Magwitch. And it's absolutely, it keeps it very clear. I don't feel that it's token. It doesn't deliberately change things just to wrong foot people who are familiar. But it does have its own drive. For example, things that we know we're going to find out much later. There's a scene, for example, on the Hulk, the prison ship,
which is amazing.
Before Magwitch and Compeyson escape. In the book, obviously, we start in the graveyard. This convict comes up. In this, we're aware that there are convicts missing before Pip even decides to go and visit his parents in the graveyard. He has a much more confrontational relationship with Mrs. Joe. His relationship with Tickler is a beautiful moment between Joe and Mrs. Joe. They find a way to really, I think, find a lot of detail in the family dynamic, whilst keeping all of the story intact, just edging things around to keep it really fresh and organic for people like me who know the story. But the story is still incredibly clear for people who don't. I thought that was handled very well.
Yeah, I talked over you, Harry. Sorry, but when you mentioned the Hulks, that's amazing, isn't it? Because we don't get to be on the Hulks normally for this.
No, we've never. And Dickens doesn't go on board. Because
no, but I love Johnny Harris as Magwitch and Tristan Gravel as Compeyson, and their relationship is really turned up, isn't it? Because
100%, yeah.
If I'm allowed to say this much, Compeyson is quite a sort of weedy kind of character normally, in that he's corrupt, but he doesn't have any kind of real physical courage. But here he relishes Compeyson really relishes his villainy, doesn't he? And it becomes this most amazing struggle, I think, which I can imagine happening throughout the series between these two characters.
Yeah, there was something especially about Johnny's Magwitch from the start when we meet him in prison on the boat. There was, literally this chained animal, someone who is bursting out of his chains, and you can just tell that something has happened to him, that he can barely be contained by his own skin. It was really raw, but he's also got this kind of poetic, strange way of talking. And it takes a great actor ultimately to have kind of animal rage and the spit and the sweat and the scarred skin, and someone who is kind of almost from another world. And yet the way that he talks is it's full of embellishments, and it has kind of almost poetic imagery. And I think, again, that is actually very much how he's written in the book.
Yeah.
He's not a monosyllabic thug. And therefore, you can imagine him being the kind of guy who is smart enough to go on the journey that we know he will. I thought the treatment of Magwitch especially was something that was achieved very well.
Yeah, it really surprised me, actually, because there's a real sort of sensitivity in his face, isn't there? You know, he describes himself as a volcano, but he explodes with the rage, like you said, and the violence and the threat, and he's a dangerous man, but his eyes reveal something totally different. And just to have Compasson as a foil, as a kind of rat that isn't scared of him, is so powerful, isn't it?
And someone who enjoys baiting him.
Yeah.
There was this idea, there's the bear and the baiter, there's the gentleman who knows I can poke this beast. I can get a rise out of him.
And he's not going to call out for help if Magwitch lunges at him. He's going to face him. And
no, he's going to.
Yeah. So that dramatically makes it so. Oh, I can't wait. Yeah. We got to the end of episode 2, didn't we? So we did see the arrival of Ashley Thomas's Jaggers, which Tell me, Harry. What do you think?
I loved it. I thought it was great. I mean, Jaggers is a wonderful character. I think the way that they've done it and the way that Ashley's played him is that you're not sure if this is a goodie or a baddie on a very basic level. It's someone who you seem to be scared of. He seems to have the same dark energy as some of these other scary characters that we've met, like Havisham and Magwitch already. He is someone who has immense power. I found him very intimidating.
Pip, darkness always triumphs over good intentions.
There's something about his gait as well, his shoulders. There was something kind of hunched in the way that his costume was built. It was almost kind of top heavy, but it was very specific and it was all in black. And you could see all the different materials in the costume and even the angle in which he wore his hat. The detail of a lot of the characterizations were excellent.
A moment that everyone waits for is the first appearance of Miss Havisham. What were your impressions then of Olivia Colman's Miss Havisham?
I thought that first scene was remarkable. And as I said, I think what's really successful about it is that you can see the conflict even within her. Someone who has decided to live like this and tortures and punishes herself daily, but kind of loves it and kind of hates it and is stuck in this perpetual paradox of pain. I felt both sides of it.
A common boy, now a handsome man. Moments before the great corruption.
And every now and again, you can see the regret in her eyes, but you can also see the pleasure. I loved. Every now and again, you saw her teeth, which were horrible. But it's also the fact that she wasn't completely frail and as if she would be blown away. She was someone who, walked with a cane, but also was still in good enough health that she could kind of function. She wasn't sitting in the shadows waiting for the children to do it. She was up and about. There's scenes of her walking down the corridor. She was more active, which I think makes her more scary because she's more conscious of what she's doing. It's more deliberate. And I think in a way it's slightly more explicit in this version right from the start about what she's doing. And she doesn't need to pretend she's not doing it, or the audience will discover why she's doing this game. She's very open about it.
Yeah. Watching this, there's something of the Revenger's tragedy, I think, in the characterizations that we're seeing. And that tradition, that early modern tradition of just kind of displaying your character out front and boldly.
Interesting, yeah, I think so.
I can really feel that. And, talking about Compasson and Magwitch, their struggle and all of that, and what Miss Havisham is getting Estella to do for Pip and all of that. Of course, Harry, you've been involved with FX yourself because you've been in the series Legion.
Yes, so I was in the third and final series of Legion, where it kind of comes full circle. I was in 3 episodes where Dan Stevens' character, he was the son of Charles Xavier. So even though I'm kind of the same age as Dan, time travel was involved, I will say, which allowed me to play this man before he loses his hair, I might add. I absolutely loved it, quite honestly. There's not a show like it. There is no mainstream TV show which embraces the surreal quite so beautifully and visually. The sets that they have and the music that they use and some of the storylines, some of it is absolutely bonkers. But it's because it's a superhero story told from the subjective point of view of someone whose superpower, if you want to call it that, is his own madness, strangely. It's to do with insanity and to do with the riches within the brain. And therefore, visually, it's got all these different effects and colors and music and time going forwards and backwards and embodiments of characters through animals. And I just think I'm so excited that someone was allowed to make it, and someone as smart as Noah Hawley was running it, and with someone as crazy brilliant as Dan at the center of it. And I will always love and respect FX, even for just commissioning something like that.
Yeah. Is there anything that, your experience of working for FX and watching their programs, is there a sort of FX kind of tag that you see each time, something that you expect that, because of course there was the FX Christmas Carol as well, which obviously Stephen Knight did. That was
and Taboo as well, stuff, another Stephen Knight show. I've been in their emblem, which comes up at the beginning of the show. It says FX Fearless. Normally those are a lovely, piece of marketing that, a few different boardrooms have put together. But there is something fearless, and they absolutely take risks. And even to do Dickens like this, they are brave. And commissioning something like Legion, and I think that I really respect that. There's so much of a certain type of TV out there, and especially now when times are tight and people want to be comforted ultimately, and people want to invest in tried and tested IPs with recognizable names and faces. People like FX know that there are people who, if it's done brilliantly, want to see people trying to grapple with the madness of the world. And I'm very glad that people like FX are allowing artists to do that, frankly.
Yeah, of course. And I feel like they create recognizable faces, don't they? They don't just rely on bringing in people that are all...
I think, and the casting in general, I mean, obviously you've got like Finn and Olivia in Great Expectations, but there are so many faces that you won't be familiar with, and so many brilliantly detailed performances throughout. I thought the casting was exceptional.
Yeah. Oh, well, Harry, it's been so wonderful meeting you.
I could talk for hours.
I could too. Bye for now.
Bye.
Bye now.